I was just thinking back on that time as the other speakers were talking this morning, and I remembered going and I was seeking something. I was going to all these motivational talks, listening to people, and I was looking for an answer. I think I'd got to a point in my life where I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Does anybody identify with that? I mean, you kind of get up on a Monday morning and you wonder why on earth are you getting up? Because that place that you're going to just doesn't do it for you. I mean, the only day of the week that I found myself excited was on a Friday. In fact, it started on Thursday afternoon because I could see the weekend was coming. You know, they used to say, we used to call it Poets' Day. Push off early, tomorrow's Saturday. You know, Friday afternoons was a wonderful day. It was the only day of the week we saw a smile on people's faces, and it dawned on me that here we are trying to live a 7-day week over a 2-day weekend. And I think I was searching for an answer. I thought there has to be something more to life than this. And I'm convinced that there's many, many people outside of this room who think exactly the same way. They just are looking for an answer because, you know, we kind of find ourselves in a system that says that your gift and talent that was given to you at birth by God Himself is no longer of value. In fact, you need to learn a skill through a 12-year school program, and maybe a few years after that, that society will accept. And as long as that skill is really difficult and no one else can do it, then they will pay you a good income. And so I find today people who've got great education, they can do things that others find difficult to do, but you know something? Monday mornings are the worst day of the week. They did a survey in America not so long ago, and the survey was to establish what was causing heart disease, because many, many people were dying of heart attacks. And you know, the obvious cause that you might be thinking of, Americans like to eat a lot of food. And in fact, vegetables don't really feature too much on their daily diet. And so the thought was that maybe things like cholesterol would be the cause of heart disease. Maybe they were smoking too much. That would be the cause of heart disease. Too much junk food. And they went through a whole little list. They began to document when people had their first major heart attack. And all of these things I've mentioned were contributing factors. But there was one thing that stood out above everything else, and that is that the most Americans suffered their first major heart attack between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Monday morning. Sundays, for many people, are not exciting days because Sunday afternoon they begin to realize that Monday is coming. And I think that's where I was in my life. I was seeking for an answer. I thought to myself, there has to be something better than this. You see, I'd gone through the schooling system. I studied for 4 years. I became a civil engineer. I'd been through the efforts to become registered as a professional engineer. I had started my own business because I thought maybe if I ran my own consulting company, it would be the answer. But still, I was seeking. There was something wrong with this picture. I felt there was something inside of me, and there was a question that I began to ask. It happened to be on the morning of my 30th birthday. I was sitting in near a town called Beitbridge. I don't know if anybody knows where that is. It's for those of you who don't know this part of the world, it's on the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And I woke up that morning and I asked myself the question that I think every single one of us is born to ask. And the question was, why am I here? And I thought, well, being an engineer, this is going to be easy. All you have to do is you find the formula, apply the formula, and in no time you got the answer. So I began, and of course I had 16 hours drive ahead of me from Beitbridge to East London, my hometown. And you know, when I arrived in East London after 16 hours of driving, I still did not have the answer. In fact, 3 years later, I still had no answer. But of course, today I know that the question I was asking was the wrong question. You see, the question, why am I here, is a question of location. Whereas if you go and look at it from a biblical perspective, all of the great patriarchs that are in the Bible, that those of you who've read that book will find that they make a very interesting statement before they begin their purpose. And before they begin to unravel the story that you read about, they make this statement. They say it in the reverse order. So we have been asking, why am I here? But if you go and read in the good book, you'll find they said, here I am. Why? You see, the question that you and I are born to ask is not why am I here? It's just one word. It's why. To accept the fact that I'm here for a reason, for a purpose, and I'm here for such a time as this, and the question is, why do I exist? And to make yourself available. And when you surrender yourself and understand that you're here for a reason and for a purpose, it's at that point that something really important happens. And for me, I began in the year 1999, and I think I shared this story briefly last time, but for those of you who are here for the first time, I began to start working on a book. I'd opened this filing cabinet. I was sharing with Anton earlier. I opened a filing cabinet, and inside there were all these notes, and I began to realize that I had not implemented anything that I had written down. And so that morning I had this idea to put together a manual to help me to implement what everyone is telling me to do. And as I had that thought, I said, hang on, if I have the need to have a tool to enable me to implement all these things that people have been saying, maybe there's other people who have the same need. And the book was born. I was so excited by that idea that I went straight to our spare room in the house and I began to work. I began to design this book. And for 18 hours every day, I mean, I couldn't get away. Anne had to bring my food to where I was working. I was so engaged in what I was doing. I went to bed when I was literally falling asleep at the computer, and as soon as I woke up, I was back there. And you know how long that lasted? 3 days. Because on the third day, I began to get a runny nose. You know, it was around this time of the year, March, April, just when people start getting the flu. And of course, I got the flu. You know what I did with that pile of work that I'd done? I took it and I put it back in exactly the same filing cabinet that had inspired me. And it sat there for another 6 months. Until somebody said something to me. Anne and I were visiting friends in Scotland, and that evening we were having a discussion in their lounge, and Rob McAleer was his name, said this, if only. I don't remember what he said after that, but when I heard those words, if only, it began to resonate inside my head. I began to realize that here I was being just like my father, who used to say, if only I bought that piece of land back in 1971, look where we would be today. And I know when I talk to you this morning, you have if onlys. You see, the people that pass on, just yesterday I was at a funeral. And I began to realize that there are so many people that get to the end of their life. They don't have regrets about the things that they did. They have regrets about the things that they did not do. It's the if-onlys that they have regrets about. And right here, irrespective of your age this morning, irrespective of where you come from, I know that you have the potential to be one of those people who says, if only I began to do back then. And I think today is a day to take action. You see, it was only 9 years after I'd started with Map for Life that I realized that I was doing what I was purposed to do. You know, whenever I engage with people, I remind them of my story, because my story began when I was 11 years old. Whenever I look at an 11-year-old child, I just can't comprehend that the journey that I'm on today began when I was so small, so young, But at the age of 11, I was standing in a prefabricated classroom in a rural or farm school as we used to call it down in the Eastern Cape, there were 98 students from sub A right to standard 5 as they used to call it, or grade 1 to grade 7. There were only 98 of us in the school. There were 12 in my class. And there I was standing waiting for my math book to be marked. My teacher was sitting in front. And suddenly my heart just about jumped out of my chest. It began to do a flick-flack. I don't know if... Yes. Do you know when Martin knows exactly what I'm talking about, maybe? And I look at, there's so many guys over here who might know, you know, that time when you touch a girl's hand for the first time. And she holds it. and your heart goes, do, 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 do. And then you get all excited, isn't it? Have you experienced that? I see some of the guys here say, I wish I knew what that felt like. But it was just like that. Well, I can only tell you it's like that now because that kind of feeling I had when Anne held my hand for the first time, which is many years later. But here I was, 11 years old, I had that. But you know, in the instant that my heart began to beat so fast, my eyes were drawn to a big map above the board. You see, in the instant my heart began to beat, I knew that I was going to map the world. And then my eyes were drawn to above the blackboard where there was a big map. And it actually had a name to it. The name was Map of the World. And in the same instant that my heart began to beat, there was this big bucket of ice water poured over me, and this voice said, that can't be your purpose. It's already been done. Just take a look. And there I looked, and I believed that voice, just like I believed that same voice that said, you're not an author, you can't write a book. And you see, we listen to this negative voice so often in our lives. We talk ourselves out of taking the first step. And the great value of this tool, Map for Life, it gets you to take those invisible ideas that you have, the spiritual concepts in a sense, and it converts them into a physical thing. So when you write it down, it takes it away from the enemy who wants to steal it. All of the great ideas that you've had have been stolen before they ever saw the light of day. Why? Because you talked yourself out of it, or you listened to that negative voice. Just write it down. You see, 9 years after starting with Map for Life, I'll never forget this experience. And I was sitting, has anybody ever been to church on a Sunday morning and found that somebody else is sitting in your chair? None of you can relate, or can you? Well, you see, I have this special spot that I like to go and sit. And on this particular morning, we arrived a little bit later than we normally do. And somebody who was new, they'd never been there before, they had decided that this was their chair. And instead of being excited that there was somebody new at our church this morning, I was actually a little put out. In fact, when I went to sit down, I folded my arms and I was rather upset. And I was blaming everyone else except me. You know, I kind of blaming everyone else why we were late that morning. But I did a very strange thing. I was so upset that I counted where I was sitting. You know, how far am I back from the front? And I counted 9 rows from the back. Sorry, from the front. The chairs were numbered. I looked at my chair numbered as chair number 12. And I sat down. But you know, that morning, while I was in the church that I go to, they start with what they call praise and worship. So there was singing taking place that morning. And all of a sudden, at about half an hour after the service had begun, my mind stopped absolutely dead. It was like somebody had given me anesthetic. I couldn't hear anything. There was absolute silence. And when I say absolute silence, I'm not talking about just audibly, but there was nothing going on inside my head. I was fearful. I stood there, you know, what was going on? I looked around because nothing's happening. I mean, my mind is always active. And then I heard these words so clearly. It was like somebody was speaking them to me. They said, I called you to. And I think if there was a camera on me at that moment, I would have looked a bit bewildered. And I was expecting the answer, because you see, back in 1996, I began to pray, why am I here? Why am I here? Why am I here? Over and over and over again. And I thought, well, here, finally the answer is coming. And I waited. And then I heard those same words again, but very, very clear, almost like a military style. I called you to. And I was depressed, because that was the end. I never got an answer. I was waiting for the answer. But on the Tuesday, I said to Anne, I said, I'm sorry that on Sunday, it was my son's 13th birthday. I'm sorry that I didn't engage. I actually slept the afternoon, this important birthday for my son. And I said, but I had what I'd like to call a God encounter moment on Sunday. And she said, well, you must write it down. I said, I don't have to write it down, because it's one of those things that people, so few people ever talk about. I said, it'll stay with me for the rest of my life. She said, you must write it down. I began to get angry with her, because this was so revelational to me. There's no need for me to write it down. And I said, well, what's the point? He didn't give me the answer. And then she said something very simple. She said, well, what have you been praying about? And it suddenly dawned on me. I had changed my prayer just 6 months earlier from why am I here to why map the world. And if you take that prayer, why map the world, the answer was, I called you to. And you see, on the 20th of July 2008, that was the answer I got. You know what happened? When I began to reflect on that, I realized that it was exactly 12 years from the day that I began to ask the question, why am I here? Seat number 12. It was exactly 9 years after I had started doing Map for Life. I had a second kind of confirmation, just in case I didn't quite grasp the first one. So when I engage with people, I say to them, listen, this was 31 years after I had the original vision at the age of 11. And so I say to you today, there's a very good possibility that before you became a teenager, before you got to that point in your life where you wanted to fit in and be like everyone else, there's a very strong possibility that God spoke to you. He gave you a vision, but somewhere along the line, you've put it aside, you've hidden it under the table because it doesn't quite fit in. You might think to yourself, what will other people think of me if I do that? Because it's so out of the ordinary. I want to tell you, go back to your early life, because when you become a teenager, you become so concerned about fitting in, and God created you unique, a one of a kind, and the reason He did that, because He designed you to stand out, not to fit in and be like everyone else. And so today I have big vision, big dreams, big goals. I know that all of those dreams and goals that I have are completely impossible for me to achieve. But what I've learned is that when you step in faith, God does things. When you begin to step out, things happen that you never otherwise thought would be possible. I'll never forget going to finally putting this book together. It was I had a deadline. Anybody aware of the Y2K? Do you remember the Y2K bug that was going to come and destroy the world? Well, I had the Y2K bug was on me, and I even got involved as an engineer working with many different organizations trying to help them sort out this Y2K bug or prepare for it. But it was at that time that I knew this was the first time in 1,000 years that we were going to be crossing over into a new millennium. So I needed to have this book complete. So I called it the Millennium Edition. And man, I put my foot, or the pedal to the metal, as it was, when it came to writing. And in 2 weeks, I finished that book that I'd started early on in the year. And Map for Life was born. You see, when we want to do something, it's really important that we have a deadline. I had a deadline that there was no way I could miss it, because if I missed it, I would have missed an opportunity. I'd have to wait another 1,000 years before I could do something like that. And perhaps sometimes we need those kind of deadlines. So set yourself a deadline when it comes to your goals. Don't put it off until tomorrow. Tomorrow just never comes. I remember going to Raymond Ackerman was one of the people who contributed to that first book. a very busy person. And maybe I should just share the story briefly with you, because when I tried to get hold of Raymond Ackerman, it was almost an impossibility. Everywhere I phoned, there would be some way, some block to stop me from engaging with this person. And eventually I got to talk to his personal assistant. Her name was June Hanks. And of course, I made a little joke about her and Tom, and so we became best buddies. And we began to chat and said, hey, by the way, Mr. A is coming up to East London, my little hometown, to open up a Pick and Pay that's going to be having its launch on Thursday afternoon. Now, being an engineer, this particular Pick and Pay happened to be just up the street from where I was living. I mean, these are all kind of coincidences which I'm realizing now, which seems a bit interesting. And you were talking about coincidence, or somebody, Johanna was talking about coincidence earlier. I had been literally walking around this particular construction site. I had met the manager. His name was Wayne. We knew each other because I had asked him questions about what was going on in terms of this construction. And here this opportunity arrives. He says to me, he said, why don't you take your manuscript and give it to Mr. A? I'm sure he will, I'll give it to Wayne. I'm sure he'll be able to get it to Mr. A. So, of course, I went straight to the construction site. Well, it was no longer a construction site. They were ready for opening. And I met with Wayne. And I said to Wayne, Wayne, Mr. A has asked me, or Mr. Ackerman has asked me specifically to give you this parcel because he has to have it with him on the plane tonight. Now, that's not exactly what June told me, but I made sure, and Wayne knew that I knew Mr. A, and Mr. A had asked me to give this to him. And so, you know what is interesting about Mr. Ackerman? The next morning, my fax machine, we still operated with fax machines in those days. My fax machine started going, and out came his 10 points on what was required to be, what he believed would be necessary to be successful in life. The busiest person on my list responded immediately. He wrote his response while he was on the plane flying back to Cape Town. And that for me was a great example of what it means to follow through on the kind of things that he felt were necessary. And one of them was answer every message the day you get it. But I'll never forget, the first thing on his list was focus on a pinhead. One of the secrets to being successful. Focus on a pinhead. At that stage in my life, I was focused on a pin cushion. I had many irons in the fire. There were too many good ideas to leave them alone. But I realized we have to be able to say no to the rest in order to be able to say yes to the best. And so today you may have many ideas. The Map for Life process enables you to filter through the things that are of a lesser priority, so you can choose the very best for yourself.